Does the organised doping programmes and the omerta that surround it still exist in cycling?
Hey everybody, I'm Matthew, and today I'm going to talk about cycling, and specifically the state of cycling in 2020 as a result of the pandemic.
Immersive sports science. Content, not commentary. Sports science, not bro science. And in this video, we're going to be talking about whether the omerta still exists in cycling. Now, the things I'm going to be talking about in this video aren't necessarily my own ideas, they're simply those found within the psychological, the philosophical, as well as other areas of research and journalism. They're not necessarily my own ideas and thoughts regarding doping and anti-doping. The word omerta comes from Sicily. It was utilized by the mafia to mean their code of silence to not basically dob themselves in. Si, l'omerta, la villa. Just made that up. That's the only reason why I grew this moustache, really. Well, actually, no, that's a lie because it's Movember, technically. Many consider the Tour de France as the ultimate cycling race of endurance. With the many doping scandals and accusations, this has come into question. That has led to the concern of the doping stigmatization and the problems faced by the sport are directly related to the belief that riders need to dope in order to win.
To understand the problems faced by tour cycling regarding doping, we need to understand its past. Doping has always been a part of cycling. From the very first Olympics, the use of strychnine injections on the winner, to the use of alcohol in the Tour de France in order to increase performance.
In the Tour de France, originally it was alcohol. You'd be passed a bottle of beer up by a monk on a mountain top and you'd drink it.
Ils entrent dans le bistrot, ils tuent tout le monde, prennent n'importe quoi, du vin rouge, du champagne, de la bière, même de l'eau, quand ils trouvent pas mieux.
And then, of course, the clever doctors have come on board saying to athletes, we can prepare you properly for the tour. We'll not just give you dope, but we'll tell you the correct diet, how to train, and then the coup de grace to give you the needle of EPO, and you're going to be 10% better than your rival. That is enormous.
This really culminated in a change of culture or an understanding around doping and its dangers in effectively the EPO era of cycling and the Tour of Shame in 1998 and the supposed Tour of Renewal in 1999, which Lance Armstrong won. 1999 was also the year that the World Anti-Doping Agency was set up in order for a coordinated effort in anti-doping. The formation of WADA was in part inspired by the Festina incident in 1998, although not solely. Public's understanding of omerta started to come around in the early 2000s with such confessions like that of John Cyril Robbins.
It is undeniable that there was or is a culture of doping in cycling. It's contrary to the general culture around us, culture of sport, and at times seemingly that of WADA, when WADA was formed in order to tackle doping cheats, especially the high-profile cheats. These are based upon paternalistic principles, as well as protecting the integrity of the sport and that of the athletes, as well as making the sport fair.
What has happened as a legacy of Lance Armstrong has been that we don't know what we're watching. And it is not Lance Armstrong alone. We should be clear about this. It is his generation and what came slightly before him with the EPO generation. Cycling has had dope for many years before, almost since the very beginning. They began with taking alcohol and then gradually went up the ladder in terms of medication until they arrived at EPO and blood dope. Because since it is ingrained in the culture of the sport, then how can you expect youngsters who are up and coming into the sport to compete fairly and win? Because you don't go into a sport to waste your time, you go into it to win. You're in there to win because that is where the big bucks are. And unfortunately, that is where the dopers are.
In 2020, the global coronavirus pandemic played havoc to the sporting calendar. It meant for the safety of the testers as well as the athletes, anti-doping organisations would not be able to test the riders. This means that there is a greater scope to dope and potentially get away with it. This means there is greater scrutiny and need for journalists to investigate the teams, the riders, and to follow up on any potential doping allegations. Relying purely on journalism, who utilise the canons of journalism as an ethical framework, is actually kind of worrying. Now, there are many reputable journalists who focus on the world of doping, such as David Walsh, who helped to expose Lance Armstrong, and Phylisophical, who through the help of Yulia Stepnova and her boyfriend was the first to expose the Russian doping system under Vladimir Putin.
Now, what we have seen in both the Tour de France and the Giro d'Italia so far is that the media has far less access to the teams. Having less access to the teams will mean that there is far less scope where the teams can actually do illicit practices. So we have a stage today, tomorrow's a break, and the day after there's another stage. On that break, they generally do a blood transfusion. And then immediately after that, you see this huge spike in performance. And that is something we saw with Floyd Landis, for instance.
The problem is with journalism is that some of them who may not be so reputable may have certain agendas, and one of those agendas is actually to write something that is printable. Therefore, certain types of biases or presentation bias may become present, or they present their work in a way that is slightly misleading or censors upon a grey area, which there are many, such as the Panorama program on L-carnitine, and even the best like Phylisophical don't always get it right. The problem with science and investigative journalism around something to do with science, such as doping, is that we've forgotten that reality matters most. It's the job of the individual to look beyond the data, and we have to look at the journalists themselves and ask whether they have conflicts of interest.
Anti-doping approaches rest upon questionable assumptions that it's an individual moral fault that's the reason why you are doping or you took performance-enhancing drugs. In reality, doping is a product of a social-economic condition as demanded by the teams or by the social environment created by the sport and those in charge. These conditions are first and foremost creating a winning environment where you are winning, that you are able to perform, as well as employment and business models. In other words, the everyday economics of the team. And in a way, this is a contributing factor to a dopogenic environment. The other main factor is that being fear. Fear of hurting your friends, fear of hurting the team riders, and more importantly, letting yourself down. But are we developing systems that have the athlete's well-being and welfare at heart? Now, we may think so, however, the non-WADA research seems to be inconclusive. The reason why I said non-WADA is because WADA only allows public research that promotes them or promotes a narrative that supports their work or at least enables us to understand the doping science a lot better. As we do know, dopogenic environments are not always healthy. Yet again, I could also argue that normal athlete environments are also unhealthy to a certain extent. However, these dopogenic environments are not always healthy for the athlete's mind. They're not taking them as an individual, they're taking their needs to perform as being the overarching reason why they should be there. And these environments are ripe for toxicity, but also to be exploited by people who don't have the athlete's well-being at heart. Now, worryingly enough, some of these riders may see these environments as necessary or even just normal. However, these athletes may be themselves vulnerable because of this understanding of the environment they find themselves in. We find that athletes are generally more vulnerable, that need to want to perform, to be able to perform, you have to perform. Because being in this case, a rider, is part of their personality, part of their identity, the way they see themselves. And being a good cyclist requires you to act and behave in certain ways. Now, if you have a dopogenic environment, that means in order to be a good cyclist, to be a cyclist, you have to dope. If you were going to take that as an ideology, as part of your identity, yet again, there are many clean athletes where that is not part of their identity. Worryingly enough, you could argue that omerta, from the point of view of some of the cyclists, or the doping cyclists, was merely a part of the sport. This gentleman's agreement that if you are doping, you don't grass up the other dopers. This is quite worrying philosophy and potentially allows for corruption to partake within the sport of cycling. Contrary to popular belief, the cyclists or the riders will be unlikely to grass up their fellow riders.
With the lack of testing, one of the greatest chances of able to catching dopers within this current generation is probably through whistleblowing.
Step one as a whistleblower is actually coming to terms with what you saw or experienced.
You essentially do this risk assessment scenario. I remember debating for months. Do I move on with my life? Sure, it really sucks, but if I don't say anything, no one will know. That's one option. I'd probably say it's the easier option to make. From the outside perspective, it's easier to say, it's wrong, go tell. But when you're stuck in it, with no resources to go to, it's basically the internal battle where you debate these things because no one else understands it.
Why am I protecting those who do shady stuff and treated a bunch of people like shit? It was kind of brewing. And then finally I had my tipping point and I was like, fuck it. I'm going to do something with this. I felt so guilty. I felt like I was betraying those who I cared about. It's so fucked up. But even though I think they were cheating, I still care about them. I know them as people. It was so hard trying to describe that to the NATO because they were like, why are you crying? Coming forward has changed how people perceive me and no one wants to work with me. I think it was the fact that there was so much risk associated with me. No one wants drama, right?
This is a catch-22 situation. You're vilified if you are quiet and you get caught as a doper, but you're also vilified if you do come out as a doper and help to blow the whistle. There are 3 identified psychological phases coming out as a whistleblower. It's understanding that it's just not black and white and that you finally realise that people do need to know. But then this decision to come out will change your lifestyle drastically.
Whether that's the teammates or the competitors, yes, some may do it because they may feel that they get a competitive advantage over someone, possibly, or because they have a great moral urge to do what is right for the sport of cycling. This, as Kelsey Erickson states, is the true ethical dilemma in sport. As cliche as I know, comes great power, comes great responsibility. But that power and responsibility must come with checks and balances. And this comes with the teams, the NADOs, the anti-doping organisations, as well as the riders themselves must all partake if they want to stop doping. That's if they want to stop doping. Criticism must go towards WADA, especially the way they handle whistleblowers.
As cyclists must ask, with the lack of competition, is it really worth putting your health at risk if there's nothing to compete for? Yet again, if you're more likely to get away with doping, why not do it now, potentially, to help you? This will be the question asked of the current generation of cyclists.
Tygart and other academics and journalists have put across this idea that maybe WADA's puritanical leadership, the old boys club, so to speak, at WADA, is negatively impacting our ability to hunt down and chase the dopers. Whistleblowers, for instance, don't feel like they're able to come out and therefore allow us to take on the drugs cheats. Then many of these drug cheats will possibly, or most likely, will get away with it in a system that promotes the few, especially like Lance Armstrong, to exert power over their fellow riders and the sponsors as well as the team itself. This promotes them to, if you like, create a certain sense of immunity. Yet again, we can't ignore, unless you are tough on doping, it would otherwise just create an environment that allows the dopers to dope. And as we've seen before, especially in cycling, they have found interesting ways to get around the system, so to speak.
Whether that's the US Postal Cycling Team faking a bus breakdown to act as a distraction, or some utilisation of another technique, cyclists have always found ways to get around the system.
And that will mean that what we're watching is a lot more artificial. There were severe doubts about what we saw in the Tour with Pogacar's performance, especially in that final time trial, and how real that performance was. Now, when we speak about the concept of doping, it is not what we see on the road as simply being dodgy.
Now, it must be noted that for many of the cyclists, their training has been heavily disrupted, and some more so than others, therefore allowing greater chance for really odd results. Some people will be on form and others not so. Some people don't train as well as they compete, and therefore when they do a good result, it's wow, where did that come from? There is also room for anomaly results. Likewise, when you do dope, you don't just dope and suddenly you become the world's greatest cyclists. You still have to train if you want to be the world's best.
It is more than that. If you see, for example, the director sportif, if in the past they were dopers, how can they have the moral high ground in telling you not to dope? It is the doping culture that, despite maybe the cyclists not wanting to admit it, is still there, is still prevalent, because the people who are part of that doping generation of Lance Armstrong are now the sporting directors of the teams. I was a convicted criminal. How can I have the moral high ground to tell an innocent human being what not to do? It would be extremely hypocritical, and I believe this is what's happening within the sport. We should not forget that there are far more stringent tests this time around, and I'm sure that the UCI will have done its best to ensure that access to the teams and the cyclists.
However, there can only be a certain amount of access and information exchange. This is across all forms of cycling, as cyclists and the teams they represent are known to be secretive in order to not give away an advantage to the opposition.
How did Pogačar, who is a good cyclist, how did he beat somebody who was as accomplished as Primož Roglič? When you see that on the final time trial, you see even the best cyclists, they're struggling, and he's just doing it with ease from beginning to end. You're either very special or dodgy. It could be one of those things. Now, we know the culture of cycling, it is dodgy anyway. So you don't know whether you're watching is real. Now, what we always saw with Primož Roglič this summer, when push came to shove, generally better, and not by a bit, significantly better than Pogačar. So we ended up with a person who had been generally losing in the head-to-head battles, all of a sudden humiliating the person who had been winning all the battles before, and not by a few seconds. There's something that's not quite right.
Although the pandemic has meant that we are unable to potentially catch those who are doping between the 2019 and possibly 2021 to 2022, it does mean, however, that ironically it may give us a chance to speed up certain technologies or processes that we weren't necessarily have before, meaning we are in the future able to have that technology ready to catch the dopers. However, many labs have diversified their operations just for 2020. With the lack of blood samples coming in to be tested, many of them have diversified and gone on to coronavirus testing instead.
If doping is not the answer, then we might be asking the wrong questions according to Schneider 2007. What those questions are, I do not know, but there's clearly something that we need to discover about ourselves and the sport of cycling regarding doping. If we are to prevent doping in cycling, it's simply another tool for us to use, another way of thinking to tackle the cheats.
Doping is an existential threat to not only the integrity of the sport, but also to the athletes themselves, depending on how you see it. Either way, I don't think we can truly eliminate doping, not even in cycling, and I don't think what has happened will truly eliminate it, but it helped to go somewhere to eliminating doping within cycling. Is the Omerta there? Who knows? Time will tell.